Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Robinson, or the Play Typer guy, as my son calls me. I'm happy today to be joined by actor and author Jen Hammond. And Jen is so many superlatives here, but I will keep it brief. She is a graduate of Harvard University and Moscow Art Theater. She has performed nationally and internationally at theaters such as the Guthrie, the Long Wharf Theater, and the Studio Theater in Washington, D.C., where she won a Helen Hayes Award for Outstanding Lead Actress. She teaches voiceover, public speaking, and dialect coaching. Her book, Returning the Bones, is out now, and it's based on her play where she played all 28 characters so well, because I saw it so well. I was like, really? There's only one person on stage? But truthfully, it was amazing. And welcome, Jen. Thank you for
Thank you,
joining us.
Stephen.
And
Thank you.
can you just tell folks about the book? I know it has such a personal connection to you. It's so important, even especially now, given our current political climate. So um, please.
Yeah. I guess I'd start with a personal connection, and please feel free to jump in anywhere. But when I was in my 20s, like so many of us, I was finding a certain dissatisfaction with my immediate family, and I'd never grown up, lived anywhere near any other family, right? And so I was feeling the lack of stories too. I wanted to know my background. Like one whole half was kind of cut off because my mom was disowned for marrying my dad. And my dad was born in 1932. He was the youngest of seven children. My grandfather was born in 1889. And I'm the youngest of my dad's four. So by the time I came along, people just kind of figured the stories were out and they weren't being connected, and so many people weren't interested in them, but I was hungry for them. So this was in the days of phone books before texting and all of that. So I was basically cold calling people. I was pretty sure were my relatives. And I connected with my Aunt Carolyn, who I sort of remembered seeing as a little girl. And she's also known as Bibi, my Auntie Bibi. And so that's how her name shows up in the book. And my bar was, I just hope I meet a decent relative. And as it turns out, she changed my life. And because she even changed the way that I parent. I met her before I became a parent. I feel like her effect is rippling into the next generation. So, anyway, so that's why I've been able to spend the past 20 something years just kind of thinking about these stories and seeing how I could put them together. And I still am learning stuff. So last weekend, I was in Long Beach. There's a whole family reunion that's been happening for the past 47 years that I did not even know about. And this was like over 200 people. And while I was there, um, I find out things like my grandfather, not only was he a doctor, but he had a doctorate of jurisprudence. He could have practiced law if he wanted to. And he opened a dry clean business and a preschool. No, kindergarten. So, the stories keep on coming because we all have so many stories within our own lifetimes, right? So, yeah, I put this together as a play. And partly inspired by my friend Krista Bell and CD Forum in Seattle, which helps grow artists. So because of them, I was able to put together the play, and Jane Jones from Book It was my core director for this as the piece developed. And yeah, it's been quite a journey. And when I would hear audiences say, I want to know more, I want to know more. And when I've heard that it made a difference for them, especially to keep fighting for things that they were interested in. And when I've heard a couple people say that they felt like Bibi was living in them, that's everything. So it was the first play that Book It ever did that wasn't a book first. And so the onus was on me to freaking make this happen. And it took a few years more than I thought it would take. Um, hashtag parenting. And but it happened. It came out last month on Juneteenth, and it's been quite a ride.
That's amazing. It'll be sort of a sort of trivia question because it'll be the book will be out and everybody's, well, it wasn't a book first. It was on, um, and what, so before we kind of go further into the story itself was about, so what kind of motivated your making it a book? It was such a great, you were doing such great work with it as a play. What caused you to make that next step?
Because plays are time-based mediums, there are so many stories that I could not include,
Hmm.
and especially the romance that happens in there between the characters of Bibi and Juan, and the magical realism that I added to the story, and so many additional historical facts that I want people to know about, especially younger people. Um, that is one of the those are some of the things that just kept me going and diving into the story a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper, and every time I'd unearth one thing, I'd unearth another thing. Um, Even things like, the role of champagne and wine in World War II. I found out through a colleague that the French resistance, that were working out in areas like Bordeaux would, uh, put cobwebs, spider webs, and things over new, fresh, unfermented barrels of wine to make them seem like they were old and aged, and it would send them to the Nazis and the Vichy government. Um, Conversely, they would send their best wines along when they knew that that would help locate people who were higher up in the Nazi regime, so that the resistance could find out where they were. And just the bravery of everyday people in the resistance. And, we're going to hear so many stories after Ukraine is finally safe about, what people were doing, people who are going to their regular jobs, working in IT, we're having to do to fight to fight Putin's war, or you know what I mean, resist it. But like, there's one character in there who I of course have to put the theater in there somewhere. So she used to live life as a set designer, but then she started working for the Vichy government, and that she basically had to kill people too and wall them up in the catacombs underneath um, the vineyards and things. So, or, you know what I mean, the wineries. So, just the lengths that people have to go to, especially when they're faced with losing their countries, with losing their communities or their sense of self.
I know what impressed me so much when I saw the play was obviously all the work you must have done. I mean, not just assembling the stories and dramatizing them, but the research. Because these are all moments in history. So, the Jim Crow South and that impact on your aunt living through that and those events,
Mhm.
and then of course World War II. And it's a tremendous amount of, I imagine, research you had to do. And I to bring that to life. Can you tell us a bit about how you assembled all that, how
Yeah.
you kind of and then grounded it in a way that and about 2 hours that people could process?
Yeah. So, first of it was distilling about 10 years of interviews with my aunt down to the stories that you saw. And it was, how much? It was like a hour 40 with intermission. I believe in keeping a story going. I want to keep people entertained. I want to keep it deep, but yeah, let's ride that momentum. Um, but yeah, and in the process, finding every story that had an arc where somebody or something was different at the beginning than they are at the end, because that keeps things moving forward as opposed to, okay, I just got information, but so what, right? And it had to pass the test of, is this both important and relevant? And then again, because it's a time-based medium, I just had to distill it down from that. So once I got all of those components and I just tried to make it into a diamond from there. That's basically how I was able to put that together. But it is so nice with a book to have breathing room to it's the pace is up to the reader, and if they wanna distill something, if they want to keep it moving, they can do that. If they wanna savor something, and I try to provide plenty of things to savor, they can do that too.
Yeah, it's sort of the humility of as an author working in plays, because obviously at rep you're starting often more often you were starting with a book, and I'd worked with Jane
Mhm.
Jones on Maltese Falcon, and one of my favorite passages, we wanted they wanted to keep but just couldn't remain. um and it's tough, it's so beautifully written, it's such
So
a
painful, yeah.
but you don't need it. You need to accept the actors can, if the point of that scene was to convey something that actors can convey with a touch or a look, because
Mhm.
you can do so much with that on stage, and you don't need that. You need to sort of trust the actors. And as a writer, it's like sort of letting that go has always been sort of the lesson of that art. And
Yeah. Or
but
that or the designers, right? Like, the reader
exactly.
know that the lights are green in the scene, right? And so you
Yeah.
need to, like, write
I
down
I
what's
don't need like
conveying the
a
feeling that
I it's some there was the Great Gatsby movie from 2013 with Leonardo DiCaprio, and
uh,
that's always the toughest because the book is so beautifully written. And I remember DiCaprio enters, and then you have Tobey Maguire's narration of of Gatsby's smile, which is one of the most famous passages in literature, and he's describing the smile, and it's like, well, we can see him. Like,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
Leo. It's you paid $20 million for that smile. You don't need
Yes.
the words.
He
But
might have
it's tough.
practiced it.
Yeah, it's tough to sort of let that go. Um,
Yeah.
so
Oh, but you were asking about research
yeah,
too, I
exactly.
forgot to say. Yeah, yes, I did a ton of research, some of it accidentally, and some of it very consciously. Like, before I ever started working on the story, I had traveled to Budapest. That comes up in the story. I had a friend who got a Fulbright there, so, went and crashed and, took that in. Um I'd been to England in the past, for a few different reasons, so I was able to take in some of that. With France, I'd been there before, and I'd lived in the Netherlands for a year. It was like 2017, 2018, I think. Um, and that by this time, the story was already living in me, so I knew I was attuned to anything that might be relevant to the story. So when I went to Paris, I was just taking in all the details and um, been to Howard, been to the medical school at Howard, lived in New York, just all of these things. And it was funny. I was helping a friend of mine move from Fort Myers, Florida to Santa Cruz, California, she and her two cats. So it was a road trip. And we were driving through Texas. And I said, of all the places I've been, that relate to the book, I haven't been to my dad's hometown of Bryan, Texas, where the first few chapters take place. And she said, "We are going." So we went a few hundred miles out of the way. And while I was there, I was, just putting in keywords like Hammond house and things like that. And that's how I accidentally found a white cousin who had this Airbnb that had been a Hammond house. That's too much of a long story to go into. But in his story, he was saying, "Hey, I went to this event and there's this black doctor there in Philadelphia who had our shared last name. And then I found out he's related. And I told my white relatives and they were not crazy about that. But I'm telling everybody, and he did a lot of historical research. And then, he's part of this whole family reunion that I went to. But yeah, it's so we went and I saw the house that my dad grew up in, and there's a place called Hammond Street, and I had to imagine a lot, but it was quite something to be on that land, you know. Um, yeah, and I wish I'd been able to go to the reservation where my great grandmother Betty had been a medical medicine woman, but we had to get those cats to California, so off we went.
um And going back to your playing 28 character, all of this research, of course, informing those characters who all felt very real. And you talked about set design earlier. You were the set, and you were the set design. The characters. You're wearing one outfit the entire time, but making us believe, with gestures and whatever different outfits and status. And this is, I would say that's your work. You've been doing it far longer before that, creating characters, getting lost in them. But for people who come to this and are sort of wow, like how and are like, how does someone do this? Can you sort of talk about a bit about this, your process, or
First, accepting that theater is a form of magic, you know? Just get out of that exclusively logical brain. That part of the brain is working hard enough dealing with finding the light and not bumping into things and all of that. There is magic. It's an ancient shamanistic thing if it's working. Doesn't work every time, but you try. Where you're where if you are really seeing what you're seeing, what you're imagining, and this applies to voiceover too. Voiceover is a visual medium. I thoroughly believe this. If you're seeing what you're seeing, the audience will see it too. Um, and that's that. And in order to get into that, you have to get into energy and the concept of energy, I feel like. Well, I do anyway. Every actor has their process. Um, but as I go from character to character, also, usually I'm working with chakras. Each character comes from a particular chakra. And there's a newer thing called PEM actor work. It's the Perticamp emotional method, came out of Germany, ironically. And the teachers will say that. The German teachers will say that. But just tapping into the potential of specific emotions living within certain organs and the direction of those, further
Mhm.
refining what that emotion is, right? So let's say I'm I'm the character of Daddy. So Daddy's the one who was born in 1898, went to Meharry, and is just making everything happen through sheer will, right? So for anybody who knows chakras, the first chakra, the root chakra, is all about food, sex, shelter, revenge, protecting one's young, right? And that energy is very forward also. In Perticamp emotional method, if I need to make my heart a little bit tighter, right? And I need my energy to go down through that first chakra. There's a certain brutality in there. He's not a brutal person necessarily, but sometimes you have to be brutal. And you can sort of tell how this changes my voice. So I don't have to think about the vocal mechanics as much if I'm just getting into the energy of that. Whereas the character of Mother, her her heart is very open and she's also very spiritually connected. So that just automatically changes the rate, the pitch, the texture of the voice as well. And just the gestures will automatically flow from that, because if I'm being a little bit more daddy, then there's not going to be this legato reverberation happening through the arms or how I'm moving my head, you know? So I hope
Mhm.
that makes enough sense, even though that was totally woo woo. I own that.
That well, it's so true, and just what you kind of had demonstrated, especially for anyone not watching this on YouTube but listening to the podcast version, it would seem like two different people. What you can do if you're register, and that's part of the voiceover. When I've reviewed certain works in movies, sometimes they've cast. They're like, oh, we'll cast for this princess role, this very famous actress yeah, and it doesn't quite work because that voice devoid from the famous pop star's body isn't
Mhm.
actually the pop. You're like, oh, actually, I'm not seeing Lady Gaga, for example. I'm not without seeing her. What I hear isn't what I
Yeah.
think it is, right? And so the ability of someone to basically look at a character and present it is always and deliver that has always impressed me. The voiceover artists who can do that, you know, again, working with Jane, I remember at Maltese Falcon, there was a great actor, uh, Jessica Avalon, and
Mm.
she had played two different parts in a play. One was a young man, and at the end of the play, she came out to speak with me. She was still in those clothes, and one of my friends who was with me was later was like, "Wait a minute, she was both of those parts? Like she didn't real like." And it's what you were saying about the magic of,
Yeah.
you know, like some folks, I've worked with some directors who were kind of like, I don't want to double cast. It's too, because it's not what you do in a movie or TV show. I always love that. So I love about Angels in America in that sense of you
Mm.
on the play of using that because it is part of the magic of the theater that people are doing sort of, it is, and you call it magical realism as well, but it's part of that also in a stage. It's like it's an enhanced reality, and I think that that is wonderful when you sort of see it. Um, and with you, especially, if, there was I think one of the first things I saw you in was the play Dog of the South, and you were just amazing in that, and not broad, where but yet bigger than life while grounded, which is very tough to do for you to understand. It's like people know it when they don't like it, and they know it when they like it, but they can't explain the difference. And it's sort of you are kind of a right there. And how, that was I'm sure a while ago, and you probably remember the specifics of creating that character and what you
I
were
remember
doing. But
Jim
it,
Gall saying, "Clamps!" I don't know if you remember that moment,
yeah,
but
exactly.
I still say that sometimes because it's so random. Anyway, sorry.
No, but I think that goes to, and I think a lot of the humor, both in your work when I've seen you on stage, and then in your own play, um, a lot of that comes from the stories of, especially in our community. I just think of um, my own aunts when they were telling stories. My mom telling stories. I mean, mom was someone also as a storyteller. She would
Yeah.
use different voices and everything when she was describing something, and I think that's part of that oral tradition, right? Like that
Yeah.
it's people telling a story in your event. Maybe there's some exaggeration and there's whatever. And I feel like that is something that Returning the Bones really captured very well.
But your mom doing that fills in a lot of details that
Yes.
you don't have to apply words to, right? So like you were
Yeah.
talking about with the Gatsby moment.
Exactly. Like as you were saying with Daddy, like it's like lowering her register sometimes. Oh, almost subconsciously when you are, or unconsciously when um describing like an old the old deacon at the church or something, like
Yeah,
just a way of like almost without thinking about it. And it really does create these images in your head, especially if you're a child and you're like hearing these stories. I just so
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And that's one of the things, if you're doing an audiobook, for
mhm.
example, with fiction, there's usually at least 25 characters. And honestly, the best thing to do as much as possible is to relate those characters to people that you know. Because again, you'll see them and you'll feel them and they'll come to life that much more than a character where you're like, okay, their voice is pitched up here and maybe they're a little raspy and, just being general with it.
Oh yeah, I love audiobooks and Audible. It is like the old radio plays, which I used to love as a kid, and
Yeah.
just how I'm playing different parts. Um, I'm also again impressed by the rigor because as an actor, I'm sure you're not doing it all in one day, right? It's over many recordings, so you're probably noting. So okay, well, what did this character sound like? Because I've got to like revisit. So it's like she didn't have an
Yeah,
English accent. I've got to make sure the accent is keyed, and keeping that through line throughout multiple recordings is just
yeah.
very disciplined. Um,
Character hygiene.
exactly.
Yeah. I
um,
was, I'm, almost done doing the audiobook for Returning the Bones, and I didn't do a chart like I usually do, and there was a section in there that I completely forgot about where there were a bunch of, different British voices, saying very British things like non-American phrasing so that the character was like, "Who what? This is allegedly English, but, ah," and I was reading at the top and I saw the little quotes coming. I'm like, "Ah, rapids ahead." It just had to like come come up with different things real fast. I mean, I could have stopped, but I just wanted to see, okay, what's going to happen here. That one worked out. Other things a little slower, a little slower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to hear that there's going to be an audiobook because that's just you're perfect for that. So that'll be fun for folks. When is that coming out?
End of July. Should be out end of
Wonderful.
July. Yeah.
So around when this
On
should be
Audible, I
launching.
think.
So we'll have the link in below to go check that out. Yeah, they're great. So I listen to them when going for walks or in the gym or
You should do some,
drives.
Stephen. You should do some.
I would. That's very flattering. I do not
Yeah.
quite. It's but yeah, the Book at Theater had just closed recently. As it's ending its run after 33 years. It won't be coming. We like to say, but a pause, but um, it will not be
Who knows? I
returning.
mean, Lin-Manuel Miranda saved the drama bookshop in New York City at the last minute, so who knows? Who
Exactly.
knows?
We
I'm
wanna
playing lotto with Book It in mind, I'm telling you.
exactly. That's and when these mid-sized theaters go, the theaters that take chances and work with that, like, can you speak a bit about your involvement with them? I mean, you were able to do something outside of what they normally do and were able
Yeah.
to stage this play. Um, what was your experience like with Book It and with a theater that size?
I'm trying to remember the first time I worked with Book It, and I can't, honestly. I have worked with them as an actor, occasionally a vocal coach, especially if there's a health emergency. And I think more than anything, I've worked with them as a dialect coach. So I've had the great privilege of working on many shows because of that. And a lot of them, let's see, there have been a lot of workshops they've done over, I think, 120
Mhm.
world premieres in their 30 plus years, and being a part of that conversation, honestly, what I was proposing and what had just started getting worked on was, a long workshop where other theater artists in the community could learn to do the book it style, because we
Mhm.
learned once, Gary, uh, Gus, sorry, took over and the pandemic hit. I do not envy him for that. We learned just how fragile that style is and how quickly it can be forgotten, sort of like family stories, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I was proposing some broad workshop where a lot of people get in on this and they get up to speed. And if they have a passion project, adapting that and then seeing where it goes so that to see if it can go from page to stage. We'll see if it gets reincarnated in some different way. I It breaks my heart, but at the same time, I am a believer in destruction being followed by a reconstruction of some kind. So I have a little pilot flame of hope that this won't get lost completely.
Mhm.
And I hope this is something that sticks in my craw, that we get better at filming things, because we have the Equity Archive that gets stuck in some dusty vault somewhere, almost never to be seen. And I feel very strongly that, as with the Lincoln Center Library in New York, where if you're Equity, you can go in and see that recording of it. I feel like we need to document these things. This ephemeral art form, it's part of why it's so precious, I feel like, and why we need
Mhm.
to show up at the theater when something happens. And I have a list. There are about 12 things where I thoroughly regret not seeing them. Maltese Falcon is another. Uh, so is uh, Dara's version of Hamlet. But anyway, I digress. But I feel like, hey, we have the capability to film these things well, and there are ways um, to share, to potentially monetize in support of the theater, right? We need all the revenue streams we can get. I think we need to deconstruct and reconstruct what all of this is so that we can come back stronger. We can learn from what's happened in the past, and that includes all of the good, genius, amazing ideas, right? Um, and and even in the study of theater, basic things like what is it trying to do? A particular show performance. Did it do it? Was it worth doing in the first place? And what to steal, so to speak. You know,
Oh,
but
definitely.
resurrect.
Um, and yeah, to that point, I know during the pandemic, and I was on the board of Book It before I left Seattle, and then I'm on the board of a theater in Portland, and
Mhm.
when we were reopening, one of the what was really important was accessibility, so that people who weren't quite able to come back to a theater for whatever reason, we would try to figure out filming. And to your point, there was a lot of legal challenges to filming and making
Yeah,
that cost effective to even put up, and a lot of it being somewhat antiquated. So it's sort of, well, it's not filming in the sense of even 10 years ago, or let alone 20
right.
years ago. And to be able to have availability of streaming, and there was a brief period during the summer of 2020 where a lot of stuff was available because they were sort of trying whatever revenue streams and openings. And it's great. I mean, theater is very expensive for people still. Having ways to bring that out and bring people, um, and as you say, to document this work. It always pains me that the stuff isn't um, preserved forever. So, sort of like the film of Chicago will
Mhm.
live forever, but, I have to just hold on to my memory of seeing BB Dwarf on stage,
Yeah,
um, and I wish that that was preserved. Um, it's, one thing that sort of came up during the was the idea of, like, people were used to entertainment in their own homes. And so people still aren't quite coming back to theaters, but what they're coming back towards, we saw like in sporting events and then big budget movies, the Tom Cruise events and
a
whatever,
little
but
bit, yeah.
also the sense of community is what they sort of miss. And so the
Yes.
idea is like, oh, and from my perspective, it's like, oh, that's it. That's like, how do we get people to the sense of, it's not about sit in a room and ignore the person next to you or be very quiet, but like engage with the people in the audience, and almost like church in a sense, and not have
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
religious for that. And I think that goes back again to Returning to Bones, because that the history of, in a way, theater in the Black community going back to the church, and everything that so much the of Black arts that became mainstream, you can all trace back to the church in certain ways, like the call and response to the
mhm.
music, of the choir,
The
and even the
griots.
stories. Exactly,
Yeah,
the girls, and,
yeah.
the barbecues and everything, and sort of how can we bring that in, especially because I think I I I want I've always wanted, Black people to have, um, more of a presence in theater, in way of telling our stories. So I appreciate it so much about Returning the Bones, and in a way that is not always, the police brutality play.
Yeah,
Right? It is about,
yeah.
our lives aren't that, and there's a reason. People's like, oh, we just put on the police brutality play, and Black people didn't come up in the numbers we expected. It's like, well, it's probably
That's
that's
why
our
I call
life.
Tuesday, yeah.
Exactly, like,
Yeah.
we actually wanna see our stories, and our laughter and our joy, and,
Yes,
um,
and
it's
even a
not
little
that.
soft life. Yeah.
Exactly, like,
Yeah.
that does it so well. And let's go back to Return to Bones, the sense of, especially right now when we're seeing,
Mhm.
um, a pushback against recognizing history, sort of the racism in the past, and the stories
Yeah.
in the past. um
I put a glossary in my book, man.
Exactly.
That's how intent I am on having people know and make connections and go, "Oh, yeah, yeah." Or even, like, things like little details that can stick in their mind, like how much somebody like Eleanor Roosevelt was for civil rights and how much her husband wasn't. These
Oh,
are
yeah.
interesting things to know, right? and how did they navigate things? But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, it is so to that point, you have that there, and it's telling that story of that time, and people might not be comfortable with that or think it's like something dangerous, and that's what
Yeah.
we're seeing a lot in politics, and it's there was recently the story of this official in Oklahoma who said, okay, well, uh don't worry, the Tulsa race massacre won't violate my critical race theory ban. And everyone's like, well, how? Because based on how the ban, it's like, okay, well, because it happened, but it was individuals. It's not because of race. It's like,
Oh,
well,
yeah, it happened independently in a vacuum.
it's in the title. It's a and this
Yeah.
ha- and this was only you're only these things are only possible because of the politics of the time. So you can't have the story told in a vacuum, similar to it it's a different story of someone saying, "Hey, I want to be a doctor," and that is a white cis male in England versus
Mhm.
a black woman in Jim Crow South. Those are different stories with different stakes and different obstacles, and to not
Yeah.
have that in an historical context can be difficult.
Mhm.
I'm
Absolutely.
and so I really appreciate how that story is told, and um, I hope we can see
I would
more
like
of
to
them.
Yeah,
Is
I would like to combine all of that, the past and the future, and what doing a multi-character solo show does if it works, because hopefully you can see that you're that there are probably more facets to you as an audience member than you think, that you could be just, all of us are accidents of birth one way or another, right? And like, just you can, hopefully it helps you let go of the rock of identity that you cling to and by seeing it in another person. But I would love to bring the old time storytelling from what you were saying, that the feeling of church, the feeling of griot, to restagings that help us feel in community, like Sound Theater's production of what is it? The Cost of Living.
Mhm.
Recently, that was a transverse theater where you see each other watching, right? So you're thinking, well, what are you thinking of this moment? Because I can see this is going on with you, and blah blah blah, theater in the round, whatever. But I also want to um, introduce elements of technology, AR, VR, for accessibility, to keep things feeling fresh and updated, to keep things in a in a way potentially affordable, especially as the AR glasses become more and more developed and affordable, so that there's all this depth happening. Hopefully enough depth that you will want to revisit, the kind of depth that happens in a really good immersive play, where there are so many details, and the journey you take through that experience is your individual journey. You're sharing something with people, but it's your individual journey. But maybe you'll come back and open these drawers on this set and look through this box and open that door, right? So there's just so much potential, so much that can happen theatrically. And perhaps this pain point that's happening right now with the closing of these mid-sized theaters, I hope there's going to be a back-asswards blessing from that, just like there was from having freaking 45 be president, after so many people were saying with Obama, oh, we're in a post-racial society. And that
Mm.
kind of shone the light.
No,
No, we're
no.
not. And no, you do need to do some work if you
There's
haven't, So you never know where that when burning down the house can give you the fertilizer for the next
Oh,
amazing
yeah.
thing.
I do hope, to your point, more immersive community-based theater can grow from this. I know I felt again that was the thing that kind of was revealed during the pandemic of what we sort of were truly missing, because it was like, yeah, I can watch The Crown and on my couch, and I can be engaged in these stories. Like, but here's what I was really missing was these shared experiences or something.
Yeah,
Even um, there used to
that
be a
created a
like
mental health crisis.
Yeah, like I need to be around other people, and share some laugh with them, cry with, like,
Mhm,
to have that in either a very large setting, like in a blockbuster
mhm.
film, or even in a small setting where it's like we're engaging and shouting at those things. And that
Yeah.
actually goes to types of stories that are told. So, there'd been a sense of theater, I wouldn't say it gotten too serious or too precious, but there was a sense of, oh, well, a classic thriller, like a classic Agatha Christie thriller, we wouldn't do that, or we wouldn't do kind of like silly farce or something that's a sitcom. But it's like audiences love that, especially the energy of it when it's on stage, that shared laughter, and to see the actors doing it, and to
Did
be
you
in a
see
room.
Yeah. Did you see, Jeeves Takes a Bow at Taproot?
I did not have a
Silly
chance to do
farce?
that. No. Yes. What did
It
you
was
think of?
absolutely
Yeah.
that, and they even extended their run,
Yeah.
and I bet I wanted to come back and see it again, but I bet a lot of people did, 'cause it
Oh,
was
yeah.
just that, we needed that, you know?
It's
Fills the
fun.
tank in a different way, right?
Well, and that's a great point as well, to wanna see something again. So not like, "Oh, I saw this and I checked my box," but like, "No, I'd like to bring a friend and experience this again," is a great thing. And your what I really liked about Returning to Bones was a sense of, this is an important story, but it's a human story and it's fun. It doesn't shy away from humor or its sadness, and it's the full human experience. And I think that is what we need to see. That's what we're drawn to see. Um,
Yeah.
so, what else do you have going on? That you'd like to tell people about, Jen?
What else I have going on? There's some dialect coaching going on, but, there's a very special theater in Port Townsend called Key City Public Theater. It's a jewel box, small equity house that works with local actors, but also there've been a number of actors in the Seattle area who've come out there to work, including folks you see at Fifth Ave regularly. And I don't know how she talked me into this, but the artistic director, who I've known since the 90s, somehow I'm writing a show called Living Incognito.
Mm.
And I think when I said, I wouldn't want to write about that, that's when she was like, and that's what you're writing about. Um, so that's what I'm writing about. And it's a love letter to the newer generations who uh, pop out looking like me, you know. And it's a conversation about what happens when your physical identity doesn't match your cultural identity. Um, and things related to that, like what happens, hashtag ancestry.com, when you find out that you have an identity that you didn't know existed. Is there such a thing as a birthright? And if there is there an expiration date to it? And at what point does it become appropriation? And what about things like when you are cut off from the language of your forebearers, and uh, and then you try and learn the language and you get told, oh, you speak with an accent, that there's this rejection, and there's always this rejection, or that when you're a child, and this is particularly important with children, when somebody asks, what are you? I mean,
Mhm.
that's a thing, right? To unpack
Very
like that.
much.
When somebody asks, what are you? And you respond with what you're told to respond, and then that person says, no, no, that's not right. Or like with me in my brother's case, he stole all the melanation before I could get to it, right? There's how many times when I was a child was I told, your brother's not your brother,
Mhm.
and there were like a couple times we came to our parents like, are we related? You know?
Yeah.
And then
That happened a lot with my own mother. I remember,
yeah.
similar complexion to you, and,
Mhm.
once you'd come to when I was in high school, some event, and someone was like, "You don't look like your mother." The sort of rejection of like, well, and we actually do, but I understand what
Mhm.
you were actually
Yeah.
seeing.
What actually
Um,
saying. Yeah.
and, and even now with my wife is white and our son, again, looks just like her, but people say, "Oh, he's your twin. And I'm like, okay, well, thank you. But also, he does look a lot
Which
like his
eyes are
mother.
you seeing with?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it is, but what's so fascinating about that, because I think of all of the, again, of my mother, but the aunts and relatives and people I know who looked like you. So the Black
Mhm.
community is not confused. It is the white community, and yet this is a story that we actually don't see. That
Mhm.
comedic, and it's a potential because I write comedy, so that is a comedic exchange,
Lots
right?
of comedic potential, yes.
But I've never seen that. Have you ever seen that, honestly, or whatever? Generally, this is
Never.
blackness, and we present it, but this is a story like completely untapped.
It's always
And
the I mean, look, Google "tragic mulatto," and just the movie list alone, there are over 50 movies created on that theme, right? And so, how about a little bit of comedy? How about all those times where I'm like, um well, from the tiny things from I'll get the taxi. I'm looking around like who I'm
exactly.
with. To just all sorts of other things. And it also depends on where you live, right? If you're more in the Southeast, there's always somebody who's going to say, "Oh, you look like my auntie," and you get seen right away. Whereas, up here, there's still a high degree of invisibility,
Mhm.
and then that begs the question of if you want to be seen, there's that whole performative race thing that comes in that influences language and the topography of how one expresses oneself. Um, boy,
Mhm.
it can get very interesting.
Have
Yeah.
you, read the book Passing?
Yes,
And it
Nella
was,
Larson.
yeah, Nella Larsen, I loved. It was always on my list to pitch and try to convince someone like yourself to write it with me and star in it. But,
Okay. Twist that arm.
yeah,
Well, I guess it
eh
was made into a movie,
yeah,
but yeah, it
exact
could still
and
be done
I
on
meant to ask
screen.
you about the movie because, the director, so the folks cast did not particularly look like you. They
Mhm,
No one, most people they would present as people would assume Black.
mhm,
And at first it was kind of weird. And I was like, well, this is not the history of like successful passing, especially in a very, very race conscious society, even when there was like a bag paper bag rule, brown bag rule, and stuff like that, and
yeah,
tests and so forth. But the director had the interesting concept of like, if she had cast it historically accurate, people
too
would
disturbed.
would be taking it as like, okay, what's the big deal? And she was actually doing something where, because you would say, well, this woman's Black, you're actually feeling what that character passing was feeling. Because in that
Mhm,
world,
mm,
it is a sense of, okay, obviously I am Black, and so if someone finds out, it's going to be this huge thing, and it's going to be an issue. And
mhm,
if it's someone who looks like me, right, then you feel the audience then is going to more likely feel the tension, because it's like, well, obviously he's Black, everyone's going to catch on, right, as opposed to differently. And there's a sort of artistic debate beyond that. But at first, I was like,
mhm,
oh, that's an interesting
yeah,
avenue to go with that, as to what you're trying to do with the audience. But again, that has appeared, as you said, going back to Imitation of Life and whatever, the sort of tragic mulatto stories are sort of tedious, whereas the fact of this happening was not ever been has necessarily been adapted. We've only sort of gotten that concept in, frankly, sci-fi, the idea of the person, the alien adapts to the human
mm,
form and is
mhm.
hiding, because that's essentially what it's like. It's like, no, 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 you actually don't know what your grandma was. You think your grandma's Italian, you think your grandma, whatever. There's a
Oh,
lot
oh,
of,
Portuguese in
yeah.
The Personal Librarian. Have you heard of that book?
Yeah.
She was the yeah, yeah. Da Costa, and what's crazy is when I read the name Da Costa in that book, so for those of you who don't know, The Personal Librarian is based on a true story about the person who was the personal librarian to JP Morgan and is hugely responsible for the JP Morgan Library and Museum. And so they chose the name DaCosta because that's just like foreign enough that that could explain some curly hair and darker hair and things like that. What was crazy was when I read that, I was like, oh, that's the last name of my dad's first wife. I was trying to think, is that really their name? No, I want to ask, but it would be awkward.
Yeah, it is
Yeah.
and there's so much story potential because it was so it wasn't centering the idea again of like how we understand freedom, we understand, Harriet Tubman
Yeah.
escaping slavery, whatever. But there was a different form of slavery that be escaped that was sort of more brutal, where just so someone like yourself could be there is literally a life or death difference in how my life will be, but
Mhm.
literally have to abandon my brother or
Yeah.
have a different type of relationship with him. And that choice and those stakes and the fact that like I can't count, or none of us probably could count because it's zero, the number of stories that really do that and really center it is still frankly shocking, perhaps not shocking, but the opportunities there to understand it, understand a point of history
Mhm.
where something like that was the entire difference of
Yeah.
how you could live and exist in the world.
Yeah. There's one story I know of, one, by a writer named Cassandra Medley, and
Mhm,
it was the only time in my entire life where, um, the casting fit my exterior, and it was for somebody who was passing, and what's
mhm,
great in that story, it's called Noonday Sun, um, it's that every character is passing in some way. But my character's one was the one where I could have gotten strung up if it got found out. But, um but I love that story. It's a classic melodrama. It is an unapologetic melodrama that takes place in the 1950s. But that's the only time that's ever come up, and I'm so grateful for that play, just to have seen it once in my life, let alone the fact that I got to perform in it.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was wonderful, and I'm sure the roles you've played and everything, that's also been something that's either been a choice or impacted what you decided to
Yes.
do, right?
Said no to a lot of stuff too.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but so once again, thank you so much for your time, for coming out, chatting with me here. It's been delightful. Um,
My
for
pleasure.
everyone, Returning the Bones, the book by Jen Hammond is out now. Go on all the places, download it, buy the physical copy because I think people still do that. And then the audio book should be coming out around the same time that this is launching on its podcast form. But check that out as well. If you've been listening, obviously you know that Jen's voice is a treasure, and her this will be a wonderful treat for you to sort of, in a way, I think, experience what I was fortunate enough to experience when I saw the play.
Thank
So
you.
thank you again, Jen Hammond, everyone, and we'll catch you next time. Again, like, share, subscribe, and take care. Bye bye.